I watched my father's face turn white as ash when David Chen, our family lawyer, slid the crisp white envelope across the mahogany table. The official seal of my grandmother's estate gleamed under the fluorescent lights of the downtown Denver law office. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My stepmother Linda sat rigid in her chair, her manicured fingers drumming against her Chanel purse, while my half-sister Jessica scrolled through her phone with that familiar air of entitlement. They thought they knew how this would end. They thought they had already won. "Before we begin," David said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "I need to read Eleanor Thompson's final wishes regarding the distribution of her $50 million estate." The number hung in the air like a thunderclap. 50 million. The same amount they had spent years telling me I would never see a penny of, because I chose paintbrushes over profit margins. Because I dared to dream beyond the family's real estate empire. My father cleared his throat, that performative sound he made when he wanted to command attention. "David, we appreciate the formality, but we all know Eleanor's intentions. The business assets go to Jessica, the properties are divided between Linda and myself, and Michelle." He paused, glancing at me with barely concealed disgust. "Well, Michelle made her choices when she decided to waste her life on finger paints instead of joining Thompson and Associates." I said nothing. Just sat there in my thrift store blazer, hands folded, watching them divide up a fortune that wasn't theirs to claim. They didn't know that I had spent every Sunday for the last 3 years sitting with Grandma Eleanor in her Lakewood mansion, listening to her stories, holding her hand when the chemo made her sick, being the only one who showed up when she needed family most. They were too busy expanding their real estate portfolio to notice that the woman who built their fortune was dying alone. David opened the envelope with surgical precision. The paper crackled in the silence. "I, Eleanor Margaret Thompson, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath my entire estate, including all monetary assets, properties, investments, and business holdings, to my granddaughter Michelle Catherine Thompson, for she alone has shown me unconditional love and devotion in my final years." The silence that followed was deafening. Jessica's phone clattered to the floor. Linda's face flushed crimson. My father's jaw worked soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air. But I just smiled. A small, quiet smile that had been building for years. "There must be some mistake," Linda finally managed, her voice shrill. "Eleanor promised Jessica the inheritance. She said the family business would stay in the family." "The family business is staying in the family," David replied calmly. "Michelle is family." That's when my father exploded. He lunged across the table, grabbed the document from David's hands, and before anyone could stop him, he pulled out his gold-plated lighter. The flame caught the paper instantly. "If that little brat thinks she can steal what belongs to us, she's got another thing coming. No court will honor a will that doesn't exist." I watched the paper burn in his hands, watched $50 million turn to ash and flutter to the floor. And I smiled wider. "Dad," I said softly, using the word for what I knew would be the last time, "what you just burned was a copy. My name is Michelle Thompson, and I learned early that in my family, love was a currency you had to earn, but somehow I was always broke." Growing up in the shadow of Thompson and Associates, Denver's most successful real estate development company, I was expected to follow a very specific blueprint. Graduate from business school, join the firm, marry someone with connections, and produce the next generation of Thompsons. But I had other plans. At 18, I announced I was pursuing fine arts at the University of Colorado. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The reaction was swift and brutal. My father called it an expensive way to become unemployed. My stepmother Linda, who had married into the Thompson name and fortune when I was 12, saw it as a personal attack on everything she valued. "Art is a hobby, Michelle," she would say, her voice dripping with condescension. "It's not a career for someone with your opportunities." My half-sister Jessica, 5 years younger and already being groomed to take over the family business, looked at me like I had announced I was joining a cult. The punishment for my rebellion was immediate and systematic. My college fund, which had been promised to me since childhood, suddenly came with conditions. I could have the money if I changed my major to business administration. When I refused, the fund disappeared entirely. "We're not funding your fantasy," my father declared over dinner one night, cutting into his steak with unnecessary force. "If you want to play artist, you can figure out how to pay for it yourself." So I did. I worked 3 jobs to put myself through art school. I waited tables at a downtown restaurant, cleaned offices at night, and sold my paintings at weekend farmers markets. I lived in a tiny studio apartment in Capitol Hill, eating ramen noodles and painting by the light of secondhand lamps. Meanwhile, my family lived in their Cherry Hills Village mansion, hosting dinner parties where they would joke about their starving artist daughter to their wealthy friends. The isolation was intentional and complete. Family gatherings became exercises in humiliation. Every Christmas, every birthday, every major holiday was an opportunity for them to remind me of what I had given up. Jessica would get designer clothes and expensive jewelry, while I received gift cards to art supply stores with passive-aggressive notes like, "For your little hobby." Linda would make sure to mention, loudly and often, how proud she was of Jessica's business acumen and how worried she was about my phase. But the cruelest cut came when they started erasing me from the family narrative entirely. Professional photos were retaken without me. The family portrait that hung in the main lobby of Thompson and Associates was updated to show just the 4 of them: father, stepmother, Jessica, and, conspicuously, an empty space where I used to stand. When business magazines profiled the Thompson family empire, I wasn't mentioned. It was as if I had never existed. The message was clear: conform or be forgotten. Come back to the family business, abandon your dreams, and maybe, just maybe, you could earn your way back into their good graces. For years, I wavered. The loneliness was crushing. There were nights when I sat in my studio apartment, surrounded by canvases that no one wanted to buy, wondering if they were right. Maybe I was delusional. Maybe I was throwing away a fortune for nothing. But then Grandma Eleanor got sick. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, diagnosed on a Tuesday morning in March. The family held an emergency meeting at the office to discuss managing the situation. I wasn't invited, but Jessica called me afterward, her voice unusually subdued. "Grandma's dying," she said without preamble. "The doctors give her 6 months, maybe less." I dropped everything and drove to the mansion in Lakewood, where Eleanor had lived alone for the past decade, ever since Grandpa Thomas died. The house was enormous, a sprawling Victorian that had been in the Thompson family for 3 generations. Eleanor answered the door herself, looking frail but determined. She was surprised to see me. "Michelle, sweetheart," she said, her voice softer than I remembered. "What are you doing here?" "I heard you were sick," I replied simply. "I wanted to see you." She invited me in for tea and we sat in her sunroom overlooking the mountains. We talked for hours about everything and nothing. She asked about my art. Really asked. Not in the dismissive way the rest of the family did. She wanted to see my paintings, to understand what drove me to create. I told her about the loneliness, about feeling like an outsider in my own family, about the constant pressure to give up everything that made me who I was. Eleanor listened without judgment. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that changed everything. "Your grandfather built this company to provide security for his family. But somewhere along the way we forgot that security isn't just about money. It's about being able to be yourself, to pursue your dreams, to know that you're loved unconditionally. You're the only one who remembers that." That was the beginning of our real relationship. Every Sunday for the next 3 years, I drove to Lakewood to spend the day with Eleanor. I brought my easel and painted in her garden, while she told me stories about the early days of Thompson and Associates, about building a business from nothing, about the sacrifices and dreams that had created our family's fortune. She also told me about her regrets, about how the pursuit of wealth had driven wedges between family members, about how she had watched my father become someone she didn't recognize. Meanwhile, the rest of the family visited her sporadically and always with an agenda. They brought business documents for her to sign, investment opportunities for her to consider, and constant updates about Jessica's progress in the company. Their visits were performances, carefully orchestrated shows of devotion that lasted exactly long enough to maintain their positions in her will. Eleanor saw through it all. During one of my Sunday visits, she pulled out a thick folder of legal documents. "I've been thinking about my legacy," she said quietly, "about what really matters and who really cares." She showed me her will, the one that left everything to Jessica and my father, with small bequests to Linda and me. "This is what they expect," she said. "But expectations and reality don't always align." Over the following months, as Eleanor's health declined, I became her primary caregiver. I drove her to chemo appointments that the rest of the family was too busy to attend. I sat with her during the long nights when the pain was unbearable, and she couldn't sleep. I held her hand when she was scared and celebrated with her when she had good days. I didn't do it for money or inheritance. I did it because she was my grandmother, and she needed someone who loved her for who she was, not what she could give them. The family didn't know about the revised will Eleanor had drawn up with her private attorney. They didn't know about the hours we spent together, or the conversations we had about fairness and family, and what it really meant to build a legacy. They saw my Sunday visits as quaint, a sweet gesture from the family disappointment who had nothing better to do with her time. Jessica once made a snide comment at Eleanor's birthday party, loud enough for everyone to hear. "It's nice that Michelle has finally found a way to contribute to the family, even if it's just keeping Grandma company." The room laughed and I felt my cheeks burn with humiliation. But Eleanor squeezed my hand under the table and whispered, "Don't let them make you small, sweetheart. You're worth more than they'll ever understand." 3 weeks before Eleanor died, she called me to the mansion for what she said was an important conversation. She was very weak by then, confined to her bed most days, but her mind was sharp as ever. She handed me a sealed envelope and made me promise not to open it until after the will reading. "There are copies in my safety deposit box," she said, with a mischievous smile that reminded me of the grandmother I had loved as a child. "Multiple copies. In multiple locations. I learned a long time ago that when you're dealing with desperate people, you need backup plans." I kept that envelope in my apartment safe for 3 weeks, through Eleanor's final decline, through her death on a quiet Tuesday morning, through the funeral where my father and Linda played the grieving family while I stood alone in the back, genuinely mourning the loss of the only person who had ever truly seen me. The will reading was scheduled for the following Friday. I arrived at David Chen's office building early, sitting in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes, gathering my courage. I knew the family expected me to receive some small token, maybe a few $1,000s or a piece of jewelry. They had made their opinions clear over the years. I was the disappointment, the black sheep, the one who had chosen art over family loyalty. When I finally walked into that conference room and saw their confident faces, their expensive clothes, their casual assumption that they had already won, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, exactly, but a quiet certainty that justice was about to be served. I had spent years being made to feel small, worthless, like my dreams and choices didn't matter. But Eleanor had seen something in me that they had missed, and she had decided to bet $50 million on it. The moment David read Eleanor's true will aloud, I watched 3 people's worlds collapse simultaneously. The color drained from my father's face as he realized that everything he had counted on, everything he had planned for, was gone. Linda's carefully constructed social status, built on her marriage to a wealthy man, crumbled before her eyes. Jessica's guaranteed future, the one she had been promised since childhood, vanished in an instant. But what happened next was what I had been waiting for my entire life. When my father burned that document in his rage, when he thought he could literally destroy my inheritance and my future, I finally got to show them what I had learned from years of being underestimated. The original will was safely locked away in multiple locations. Eleanor had taught me that preparation was power, that people who had spent their lives manipulating others would never hesitate to destroy evidence if they thought they could get away with it. She had predicted exactly what would happen in that room, and she had made sure I was ready for it. As I watched the ashes of the copy flutter to the floor, I realized that this was my moment of transformation. No longer the struggling artist begging for acceptance. No longer the family disappointment hoping for crumbs of affection. I was Eleanor Thompson's chosen heir, the keeper of her legacy, and the one person in the room who had earned what I was about to receive. The best part was that I hadn't had to manipulate or scheme or hurt anyone to get there. I had simply loved my grandmother unconditionally and been there for her when she needed me most. The inheritance wasn't revenge, it was recognition. Recognition that kindness mattered more than profit margins, that genuine love was worth more than calculated loyalty, and that sometimes the person everyone counts out is the one who wins in the end. David Chen cleared his throat and pulled another copy of the will from his briefcase. As I was saying, he continued calmly, as if nothing had happened, the entire estate goes to Michelle Thompson, effective immediately. He looked directly at my father, whose hand was still smoking from the burned paper. And I should mention that attempting to destroy legal documents is a felony, Robert. I hope for your sake that was just a moment of poor judgment. The silence that followed was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. After years of being talked over, dismissed, and ignored, I finally had their complete attention. And I was just getting started. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. David Chen methodically placed the second copy of the will back in his briefcase, while my father stared at his empty hands, still processing what had just happened. Linda's face had gone from flushed red to a sickly pale green, and Jessica looked like she might actually throw up right there on the conference table. I should have felt triumphant. I should have been savoring their shock, their disbelief, their complete and utter devastation. But instead, I felt something else entirely. A cold, crystalline clarity that had been building for years finally clicked into place. This wasn't the end of their manipulation. This was just the beginning of their desperation. My father was the first to recover. He straightened his tie, composed his face into that familiar mask of controlled authority, and turned to David with the voice he usually reserved for closing million-dollar deals. David, I need to speak with you privately. There are some irregularities here that need to be addressed. My mother was very ill in her final months, clearly not of sound mind. This will is obviously the result of undue influence. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Undue influence. The legal term for what happens when someone manipulates a vulnerable person into changing their will. It was brilliant, really. Paint me as the predatory granddaughter who took advantage of a sick old woman's confusion and grief. Make Eleanor the victim and themselves the ones fighting for justice. David didn't even blink. Robert, I can assure you that your mother underwent extensive psychological evaluation before making these changes to her will. She was examined by 3 independent physicians, all of whom certified her mental competency. The documentation is ironclad. But I could see the wheels turning in my father's head. He wasn't going to accept this quietly. None of them were. They had spent their entire lives believing that wealth and status could solve any problem, overcome any obstacle. In their minds, I was still the same powerless girl who had been cut off and cast out years ago. They thought they could intimidate me into walking away. Linda leaned forward, her voice taking on that syrupy tone she used when she wanted something. Michelle, sweetheart, I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding here. Your grandmother was very confused in her final months. You know how much the medication affected her thinking. She probably didn't realize what she was signing. She reached across the table like she was going to take my hand, but I pulled back. We can fix this, honey. We can make sure everyone gets what they deserve. What they deserve. The phrase ricocheted around my brain like a bullet. What did they deserve exactly? Years of excluding me from family functions? Making me work 3 jobs to pay for college while they took luxury vacations? Telling their friends I was going through a rebellious phase when I was 25 years old and supporting myself? Erasing me from family photos like I was some kind of embarrassing mistake? What I deserve, I said quietly, is what Grandma Eleanor chose to give me. And what you deserve is exactly what you're getting. Jessica finally found her voice, and when she spoke, it was with all the entitlement of someone who had never been denied anything in her life. "This is insane, Michelle. You can't seriously think you're qualified to run Thompson and Associates. You've never worked a day in the family business. You don't know anything about real estate development or investment portfolios or managing a $50 million estate. You'll destroy everything Grandpa Thomas built." There it was, the assumption that had driven their treatment of me for years. That because I had chosen art over business, I was somehow incapable of understanding money or making rational decisions. That my college degree in fine arts had somehow lobotomized me, leaving me unable to comprehend basic concepts like profit and loss. What they didn't know was that Eleanor had spent the last 3 years teaching me everything about the family business. Not just the public face that everyone saw, but the real story. The shortcuts that had been taken, the corners that had been cut, the questionable deals that had padded their profits at the expense of their reputation. Eleanor had kept meticulous records of everything, and she had shared it all with me. She had also introduced me to her private financial advisor, a brilliant woman named Sarah Martinez, who had been managing Eleanor's personal investments for over a decade. Sarah had walked me through every aspect of the estate, from the real estate holdings to the stock portfolios to the offshore accounts that my father didn't even know existed. I wasn't just inheriting money, I was inheriting a complete financial empire, and I understood exactly what I was getting. But I didn't tell them any of that. Instead, I smiled that same quiet smile and said, "I guess we'll find out, won't we?" My father's composure finally cracked. He slammed his hand on the table hard enough to make everyone jump. "This is ridiculous. I'm contesting this will. I'm going to fight it with everything I have. Michelle, you have no idea what you're up against. I will tie this up in court for years. You won't see a penny of that money until you're old and gray." The threat was supposed to scare me. It was supposed to make me realize that I was outgunned, outmaneuvered, and outclassed. Poor little Michelle, with her art degree and her thrift store clothes, going up against Robert Thompson and his army of corporate lawyers. It should have been terrifying. Instead, I felt something inside me settle into place like the final piece of a puzzle. This was the moment Eleanor had prepared me for. The moment when they would show their true colors, when they would prove that they cared more about money than family, more about winning than doing what was right. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. With deliberate slowness, I opened the voice recording app and set the phone on the table between us. The red recording dot was clearly visible. "I'm sorry, Dad, could you repeat that? I want to make sure I have an accurate record of your threats for my attorney." The room went silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. The silence of people who had just realized they were no longer in control of the narrative. Linda was staring at the phone like it was a poisonous snake. Jessica's mouth was hanging open. My father's face was cycling through several different shades of red. David Chen was watching the whole scene with the detached interest of someone who had seen this exact drama play out in dozens of other conference rooms. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "we should all take a moment to collect ourselves. These are emotional circumstances, and it's important that everyone understands the legal implications of their words and actions." But I was done taking moments. I was done being careful. I was done letting them treat me like I was still the powerless girl who needed their approval to exist. "No, David, I think we should keep going. This is very educational." I looked directly at my father. "Please, continue explaining how you're going to use your wealth and connections to prevent me from accessing my legal inheritance. I'm sure the probate court will find it very interesting. The beautiful thing about finally having power is that you don't have to use it aggressively to make it felt. Sometimes the most devastating weapon is simply refusing to be intimidated anymore. For years they had controlled me through fear. Fear of being cut off. Fear of being alone. Fear of losing what little connection to the family I had left. But now that I had nothing left to lose, I was discovering that I was much stronger than any of them had imagined. My father tried a different approach. He sat back in his chair, forced his voice into a more reasonable tone, and gave me the look he probably used on difficult clients. "Michelle, let's be practical here. You're 28 years old. You've never managed anything more complicated than a checking account. Do you really think it's wise to take on this kind of responsibility? What if we worked out some kind of arrangement? You could keep a portion of the inheritance, maybe 10 or 15 million, and let the family business continue operating as it always has. Everyone wins. 10 or 15 million. Like he was doing me a favor by offering me a fraction of what was legally mine. Like I should be grateful for his generosity in allowing me to keep some of my own inheritance. That's very generous of you, Dad, I said, making sure my voice carried just the right amount of mock gratitude. But I'm curious about something. If I'm too young and inexperienced to manage $50 million, how is Jessica qualified to inherit it? She's only 23, and her biggest accomplishment is getting a business degree and working for the family company for 18 months. Jessica bristled. That's completely different. I've been training for this my whole life. I understand the business. I have relationships with our clients and investors. I'm not some outsider who's going to come in and destroy everything we've built. Outsider. The word hit like a slap. After everything we had supposedly been through as a family, after all the years of being told I was loved despite my choices, I was still an outsider. Still someone who didn't belong, who didn't deserve to be included in the legacy that my great-grandfather had started and my grandmother had preserved. But here's what they didn't understand about being an outsider. It gives you perspective. When you're not part of the inner circle, you see things that the people on the inside miss. You notice the cracks in the foundation, the rot behind the polished exterior, the lies that everyone tells themselves to justify their actions. I had spent 3 years listening to Eleanor's stories, and I knew things about Thompson and Associates that would make their carefully constructed reputation crumble overnight. I knew about the bribes disguised as consulting fees, the environmental shortcuts that had contaminated groundwater in 3 different counties, the pension fund that had been borrowed from to cover cost overruns on a project that had made my father a millionaire. Eleanor had kept records of everything, not because she was planning to expose them, but because she believed in accountability. She had spent her final years trying to figure out how to clean up the mess without destroying the family. In the end, she had decided that the only way to save the Thompson legacy was to put it in the hands of someone who actually had a conscience. I stood up slowly, gathering my purse and coat. The movement made everyone tense, like they were expecting me to storm out dramatically. Instead, I looked around the room at each of them in turn. You know what, Dad? You're absolutely right. I am an outsider. I'm someone who chose to build my own life instead of riding on the family name. I'm someone who worked 3 jobs to put myself through college while you paid for Jessica's private tutors and luxury apartments. I'm someone who showed up for Grandma Eleanor when she was dying while you were too busy expanding your portfolio to visit. I paused, letting that sink in. And you're also right that I don't know everything about running a business. That's why I'm going to be very careful about who I trust with important decisions. I'm going to want to review everything. Every contract, every deal, every financial transaction from the past 5 years. I'm going to want to understand exactly how this company has been operating and whether those operations align with my values. The color drained from my father's face. Linda looked like she might faint. Even David Chen raised an eyebrow, clearly understanding the implications of what I was saying. You see, I continued, my voice staying perfectly calm and reasonable, when you inherit a business, you don't just inherit the assets, you inherit the liabilities too. All of them. And I have a feeling there are quite a few liabilities that I'm going to need to address. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. I wasn't just talking about taking over the company. I was talking about investigating it. About potentially exposing whatever dirty secrets they had been hiding. About holding them accountable for years of questionable decisions. My father tried one last desperate play. Michelle, you're making a huge mistake. The real estate business is complicated. There are relationships that took decades to build, deals that require insider knowledge, regulatory issues that an outsider couldn't possibly understand. If you try to come in and change everything, you'll destroy the company and lose the money anyway. It was interesting how quickly our family legacy had become the money when they realized they might lose it. But I had learned something important from watching them operate over the years. Bullies always reveal their weakness when they're scared. And right now, they were terrified. Maybe you're right, I said thoughtfully. Maybe I will make mistakes. Maybe I'll lose some of the money. But here's the thing. It's my money to lose, just like it was Grandma Eleanor's money to leave to whoever she chose. And she chose me. I walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back. Oh, and Dad, about that threat to tie this up in court for years? I should mention that Grandma Eleanor anticipated that response. She set aside a separate legal fund specifically to defend against frivolous challenges to her will. Turns out she knew her family better than they knew her. The look of defeat on his face was almost pitiful. Almost. But I had seen what these people were capable of when they thought they had power over someone. I had felt the weight of their disapproval, their manipulation, their casual cruelty. Whatever sympathy I might have had for them had been burned away years ago, one humiliation at a time. David Chen cleared his throat. If there's nothing else, I believe we can conclude today's meeting. Michelle, I'll need to schedule some time with you this week to go over the estate transfer process. There are quite a few documents to review and sign. As I reached for the door handle, Jessica's voice stopped me. It was small and uncertain, nothing like the confident young woman who had been groomed to inherit an empire. Michelle, wait. What happens to us now? What happens to the family? I turned to look at her, this half-sister, who had been handed everything I had been denied, who had never questioned why she deserved more, simply by virtue of being born to the right mother. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. She had never learned to survive on her own, never developed the strength that comes from fighting for everything you have. Jessica, I said gently, you're 23 years old with a business degree and 3 years of experience at a successful real estate company. You have every advantage in the world except the one you've been counting on. You'll figure it out. Then I looked at Linda and my father. As for the rest of you, I suggest you start thinking very carefully about your next moves. Because I meant what I said about reviewing everything. Every decision, every transaction, every choice that's been made with Thompson, money over the past 5 years. I'm going to be a very hands-on owner. I walked out of that conference room and into the elevator, feeling lighter than I had in years. The weight of their expectations, their disapproval, their constant judgment, was finally off my shoulders. I was no longer fighting for scraps of affection from people who had never valued me. I was no longer the family disappointment begging for acceptance. I was Eleanor Thompson's heir, the inheritor of her legacy and her vision for what the family could become. And unlike them, I had actually listened when she talked about responsibility, about using wealth to build something meaningful, instead of just accumulating more wealth. The elevator reached the parking garage, and I walked to my beat-up Honda Civic, the same car I'd been driving since college. Tomorrow, I could buy any car I wanted. I could buy a mansion, travel the world, never work another day in my life. But first, I had some research to do. Eleanor had left me more than money. She had left me information, files full of documents that told the real story of Thompson and Associates, evidence of the shortcuts and compromises that had built the family fortune. She had also left me a choice. I could clean up the mess quietly, or I could let the truth come to light and let the chips fall where they may. As I drove home to my small apartment, I thought about that choice. Part of me wanted to be merciful, to give them a chance to make things right without destroying their lives completely. After all, they were still family, even if they had never treated me like it. But then I remembered the look on Linda's face when she called me sweetheart, and tried to convince me that Eleanor had been too confused to know what she was doing. I remembered my father's threat to tie up the inheritance in court until I was old and gray. I remembered Jessica calling me an outsider, as if I hadn't grown up in the same house, attended the same family gatherings, shared the same last name. They had made their choice years ago when they decided I didn't matter. Now it was time for them to live with the consequences of that choice. And it was time for me to stop trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it. I parked in front of my building and sat in the car for a moment, looking up at the modest apartment that had been my sanctuary for so many years. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, I would start the process of becoming someone they had never imagined I could be. But tonight, I was still just Michelle Thompson, the artist who had learned that sometimes the greatest masterpiece you can create is your own life. And I was just getting started painting. I woke up the next morning to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. The family had clearly spent the night strategizing, and their desperation was palpable even through the digital silence of my phone. I scrolled through the messages while sipping coffee from my favorite chipped mug, the one I'd bought at a garage sale 5 years ago when I couldn't afford to shop anywhere else. The texts ranged from pathetic to threatening. Linda had sent a series of increasingly frantic messages starting at 2 in the morning. "Michelle, we need to talk. This is tearing the family apart." Then, an hour later, "Please call me back. I know we can work this out." By 4 a.m., her tone had shifted. "You're making a terrible mistake. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." Jessica's messages were shorter but more revealing. "This isn't fair. I've worked for this my whole life." Then, "Dad says you're gonna ruin everything. Is that what you want?" And finally, the one that made me laugh out loud. "I'm supposed to get married next year. How am I supposed to explain this to Marcus?" Marcus, her fiancé from the trust fund family who owned half of Aspen. I wondered if Jessica had ever considered that maybe, just maybe, Marcus loved her for herself and not for her inheritance. Probably not. In their world, love and money were so intertwined that separating them was almost impossible. My father's messages were more calculated. Professional. "Michelle, we need to discuss the transition process. There are urgent matters that require immediate attention." As if he was still in charge. As if this was all just a temporary misunderstanding that could be resolved with the right combination of pressure and negotiation. But it was the voicemail that really got my attention. It had come in at 3:17 a.m., and I could hear the alcohol in his voice, the slurred edges that betrayed just how rattled he really was. "Michelle, this is your father. I know you think you've won something here, but you have no idea what you're dealing with. There are things about this business, about this family, that you don't understand. Things that could hurt a lot of people if they came to light. I'm trying to protect you, but you're not making it easy. Call me back. We need to talk before you do something we'll all regret." The threat was clear enough. He knew I had access to Eleanor's files, and he was afraid of what I might find. But what he didn't realize was that I had already found it. All of it. I had spent the entire weekend after Eleanor's funeral going through the boxes she had left for me in her study. Financial records dating back 15 years, correspondence with regulatory agencies, internal memos that painted a very different picture of Thompson and Associates than the one presented to the public. Eleanor had been meticulous in her documentation, and she had been horrified by what she discovered. The company that my great-grandfather had built on principles of integrity and community development had become something else entirely under my father's leadership. A machine for generating wealth at any cost, with no regard for the damage left in its wake. There was the apartment complex in Aurora where they had used substandard materials to cut costs, resulting in a roof collapse that injured 3 families. The insurance settlement had been sealed, but Eleanor had kept copies of everything. There was the shopping center in Thornton, where they had bribed city officials to overlook environmental violations, contaminating the groundwater for miles around. There was the pension fund they had borrowed from to cover losses on a failed casino project, leaving dozens of retirees without the security they had been promised. Each revelation had been carefully documented, cross-referenced, and filed away. Eleanor hadn't been planning to expose them. She had been planning to fix them. She had set aside money to compensate the victims, to clean up the environmental damage, to restore the pension fund. But she had run out of time. Now it was my responsibility. Her final gift to me wasn't just wealth. It was the opportunity to restore the family name, to turn Thompson and Associates back into the kind of company my great-grandfather would have been proud of. But first I had to deal with the people who had corrupted it. I finished my coffee and called Sarah Martinez, Eleanor's financial advisor, who was now technically my financial advisor. Sarah had been expecting my call and had already prepared a comprehensive briefing on the estate transfer process. "Michelle," she said without preamble, "I need you to understand that the next few weeks are going to be intense. Your family is going to fight this transfer with everything they have. They're going to challenge your competency, question the will's validity, and try to paint Eleanor as a confused old woman who was manipulated by her granddaughter." I had expected this. How strong is their case? Legally? Non-existent. Eleanor was extremely thorough in documenting her mental competency, and the will was witnessed by 3 independent parties. But that doesn't mean they won't try. Rich people have a way of dragging out legal proceedings until their opponents run out of money to fight back. Except I'm not going to run out of money, Sarah laughed. No, you're definitely not. But they don't know that yet. They're still thinking of you as the struggling artist who can't afford good legal representation. That's going to work in our favor. We spent the next hour going over the logistics of the estate transfer. Eleanor had structured everything brilliantly, with multiple layers of legal protection and several offshore accounts that would be impossible for my father to access or freeze. Within 72 hours, I would have full control of the entire Thompson empire. After I hung up with Sarah, I sat in my apartment and really looked around for the first time in years. The tiny kitchen with the ancient appliances, the living room that doubled as my art studio, the bedroom that barely fit a twin bed and a dresser. This had been my sanctuary, the place where I had rebuilt myself after my family cast me out. But it was also a testament to their cruelty, to the years I had spent struggling while they lived in luxury. Tomorrow I could move anywhere I wanted. I could buy a mansion in Cherry Hills Village, right next to the house where I had grown up feeling unwanted. I could hire a staff, buy expensive cars, live the kind of life that Jessica had always taken for granted. But that wasn't what I wanted. What I wanted was justice. Not revenge, exactly, but accountability. I wanted my father to face the consequences of his choices. I wanted Linda to understand that her cruel comments and casual dismissals had hurt a real person. I wanted Jessica to learn that privilege was something you earned, not something you inherited. Most of all, I wanted to honor Eleanor's memory by turning Thompson & Associates back into the kind of company she could be proud of. That meant cleaning house. And cleaning house meant exposing the truth about what had been done in the family name. I spent the rest of the day making phone calls. First to an investigative journalist I had met at a gallery opening, someone who specialized in corporate corruption stories. Then to the environmental lawyers who had been trying to get justice for the families affected by the contaminated groundwater. Finally, to the retired employees whose pensions had been stolen to cover my father's bad investments. I didn't tell any of them exactly what I had planned. I just asked questions, gathered information, and started building a network of people who had been harmed by Thompson & Associates. People who deserved to know that someone was finally listening, someone who had the power to make things right. By Monday morning, I was ready for war. The first salvo came in the form of a process server who knocked on my door at 7 a.m. My father was challenging the will, exactly as Sarah had predicted. The legal papers accused me of elder abuse, undue influence, and financial manipulation. Reading them felt like being slapped with every cruel thing they had ever said about me, formalized into legal language and filed with the court. But 2 could play that game. I called Sarah and gave her the green light to file our countersuit. We were going after them for years of financial mismanagement, breach of fiduciary duty, and fraud. More importantly, we were demanding a full forensic audit of all Thompson & Associates transactions going back 5 years. The phone rang 20 minutes after our filing hit the court system. My father's voice was tight with controlled rage. "Michelle, what the hell do you think you're doing? You're going to destroy this family." "No, Dad," I said calmly. "You already did that. I'm just cleaning up the mess." "You have no idea what you're talking about. Those transactions were all legitimate business dealings. If you try to make something sinister out of standard industry practices, you're going to look like a fool." Standard industry practices. That was his defense for bribing city officials and stealing pension funds. Standard industry practices. Then you should have nothing to worry about, I replied. The audit will clear everything up. There was a long pause. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Gone was the bluster and intimidation. What remained was something much more dangerous. Calculation. "Michelle, I'm going to give you one chance to walk away from this. Take $10 million and disappear. Keep your mouth shut about family business, and we'll call it even. And if I don't, then you're going to learn why people in this town respect the Thompson name. You think you can come in here with your art degree and your self-righteous attitude and take on an empire that took 3 generations to build? You're out of your league, little girl. Little girl. After everything that had happened, after I had legally inherited control of his entire world, he was still trying to make me feel small and powerless. It might have worked once. But I wasn't the same person who had sat in that conference room a week ago, hoping for scraps of affection from people who saw me as an inconvenience. Dad, I said softly, I think you're the one who's out of your league. You see, while you were busy dismissing me as a failure, I was learning things. Important things. Like how to document conversations for legal purposes. I let that sink in for a moment before continuing. This call is being recorded, by the way, along with the voicemail you left Saturday night where you threatened me. My attorney thinks a jury would find that very interesting. The line went dead. But I knew this was just the beginning. My father hadn't built his reputation by backing down from fights, and he certainly wasn't going to roll over now. He would escalate, and he would play dirty. The question was how far he was willing to go to protect his secrets. I didn't have to wait long to find out. That afternoon, Jessica showed up at my apartment. She looked terrible, like she hadn't slept since the will reading. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, and her designer clothes were wrinkled. When I opened the door, she immediately started crying. Michelle, please, you have to stop this. Dad is talking about selling the house, liquidating everything he can before the audit starts. Mom is having panic attacks. I had to postpone my engagement party because Marcus's parents are asking questions about our family's finances. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Jessica had never been deliberately cruel to me the way Linda and my father had been. She had just been thoughtlessly dismissive, casually indifferent to my existence. In her mind, she probably thought she had been a perfectly adequate sister. Jessica, none of this had to happen. If you had just accepted Eleanor's decision, if you had treated me with basic respect and dignity, we could have worked something out. But instead, you called me an outsider. Dad threatened to destroy my life in court. Linda tried to gaslight me into thinking Eleanor was too confused to know what she was doing. Jessica wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. We were upset. People say things they don't mean when they're upset. No, Jessica. People reveal who they really are when they're upset. And what you revealed is that you've never considered me part of this family. I was just an inconvenience to be managed, a problem to be solved. She tried a different approach. What if we gave you more? What if it was 20 million instead of 10? You could travel, buy a house, never have to worry about money again. Isn't that what you want? What I wanted. As if this was all about greed, as if I was holding out for a bigger payday. She still didn't understand that this had never been about the money. It had been about respect, about acknowledgement, about being treated like a human being instead of a burden. Jessica, I don't want your money. I want you to understand that your actions have consequences. I want Dad to face justice for the people he's hurt. I want Linda to stop pretending she's some kind of victim in all this. Jessica's tears stopped abruptly. When she looked at me again, her expression had hardened into something I recognized from our childhood. The cold, entitled look she got when she didn't get her way. You're really going to destroy us, aren't you? Your own family. You destroyed yourselves. I'm just refusing to help you cover it up anymore. She stood up and walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back. When she spoke, her voice was flat and emotionless. You know, I used to feel sorry for you. Poor Michelle, all alone, trying so hard to make it as an artist. But I see now that Dad was right about you. You're vindictive and jealous and bitter. You're going to end up alone and miserable, and you'll deserve every minute of it. After she left, I sat in my apartment and felt the full weight of what I was doing. This wasn't just about holding them accountable for their corruption. It was about burning down the only family I had ever known. By the time this was over, there would be no going back, no possibility of reconciliation. For a moment, I wavered. Maybe I could take the 20 million and walk away. Maybe I could let sleeping dogs lie and just focus on building a new life for myself. Maybe the past didn't have to define the future. But then I thought about Eleanor, lying in her hospital bed during those final weeks, crying as she told me about the pension fund and the families who had been hurt. I thought about the environmental reports that my father had buried, the cancer clusters that had developed around the contaminated groundwater sites. I thought about all the people who had been sacrificed on the altar of Thompson & Associates' profit margins. I couldn't walk away. Not because I was vindictive or bitter, but because I was the only person in a position to make things right. Eleanor had given me more than wealth. She had given me responsibility. That evening, I called the investigative journalist back and told her I was ready to talk. I called the environmental lawyers and offered to fund their lawsuit. I called the retired employees and promised them that their pensions would be restored. And then I called my father one last time. Dad, it's Michelle. I want you to know that I tried to do this quietly. I tried to give you a chance to make things right on your own. But you chose to fight me instead of facing the truth about what you've done. Michelle, don't do anything stupid. You're going to regret this. Maybe I will, but at least I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror. Can you say the same? I hung up before he could answer. Tomorrow, the story would break. Tomorrow, the world would learn the truth about Thompson and Associates. Tomorrow, my family would discover that the little girl they had dismissed and discarded had grown up to become someone they should have feared. But tonight, I was going to paint. I set up my easel in front of the window overlooking the city lights and started working on a new canvas. Something bold and bright and full of fire. Something that captured the feeling of finally being free to be exactly who I was meant to be. The phone rang constantly, but I ignored it. Whatever chaos was erupting in their world could wait until morning. Right now I had art to make and a future to create. A future where justice mattered more than profit. Where integrity mattered more than wealth, where being right mattered more than being powerful. It was going to be a beautiful future. And they weren't invited. The headline hit the Denver Post's website at 6 a.m. sharp. Thompson and Associates under investigation. $50 million inheritance sparks corporate fraud allegations. By 7 a.m., it was trending on social media. By 8 a.m., the local news stations were running the story on their morning shows. I watched it all unfold from my laptop while drinking coffee from my chipped mug, the one that would probably become a museum piece someday when people wrote the definitive account of how the Thompson empire fell. The investigative journalist Maria Santos had done her homework. The article was devastating in its precision, laying out years of documented corruption, with the kind of methodical detail that made denial impossible. The environmental violations were front and center, complete with photographs of the contaminated sites and medical records showing elevated cancer rates in the affected neighborhoods. The pension fund theft was explained in simple terms that any reader could understand. Hard-working people had paid into a retirement system that was supposed to provide security, only to have their money stolen to cover a casino investment that everyone except my father had known was doomed to fail. But the real knockout punch was the financial analysis. Maria had worked with forensic accountants to trace exactly where the stolen money had gone. Luxury vacations, designer clothes, private school tuition for Jessica, a second home in Vail that was officially listed as a business retreat, but had never hosted a single corporate event. Every dollar of stolen pension money had been converted into lifestyle upgrades for the Thompson family. My phone started ringing at 6:15 a.m. First the reporters, then the lawyers, then what sounded like every person I had ever met in my entire life. I let them all go to voicemail. There would be time for interviews and statements later. Right now, I wanted to watch the dominoes fall. The first domino was Jessica's engagement. Marcus called off their wedding before 9 a.m., according to the tearful voicemail she left on my phone. Apparently, his family's PR team had advised him that association with the Thompson name was now a liability. 20 years of friendship with your father, and he drops me the moment things get complicated. Jessica sobbed into the phone. This is all your fault, Michelle. I hope you're happy. The second domino was Linda's charity work. By 10 a.m., 3 different nonprofit organizations had issued statements distancing themselves from their longtime board member. The women's shelter, where she had posed for photo opportunities while privately complaining about those people, was particularly pointed in their denunciation. We cannot continue to associate with individuals whose wealth may have been obtained through the exploitation of vulnerable communities. The third domino was my father's professional reputation. The Colorado Real Estate Commission announced they were launching an immediate review of his license. The Denver Chamber of Commerce removed him from their board of directors. 2 major clients canceled projects that were already under construction, willing to eat the financial penalties rather than be associated with the Thompson name. But the fourth domino was the one that really mattered. At 11:30 a.m., the FBI issued a statement confirming that they were opening a federal investigation into Thompson and Associates for wire fraud, money laundering, and violation of environmental protection laws. Agent Jennifer Walsh, the lead investigator, held a brief press conference where she announced that anyone with information about the company's practices should contact the federal tip line immediately. That's when my father finally broke. He showed up at my apartment at noon, bypassing the building's security by tailgating behind another resident. When I opened the door, he looked like he had aged 10 years overnight. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled and stained. But it was his eyes that really showed the damage. The confident arrogance that had defined him for as long as I could remember was gone, replaced by something that looked dangerously close to panic. "Michelle," he said, pushing past me into the apartment without invitation. "We need to talk. Now." "Actually, we don't. Anything you want to say to me, you can say through your attorney." He whirled around, and for a moment I thought he might actually grab me. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The FBI is seizing our assets. They're going through our computers, our files, our bank records. 20 years of my life's work, destroyed because you couldn't let sleeping dogs lie. 20 years of fraud and corruption, you mean? Business, Michelle. It was just business. You think every successful company in Denver got that way by following every single regulation to the letter? You think your precious grandmother built this empire by being some kind of saint?" That was when I knew he still didn't understand. He still thought this was about business practices, about regulatory compliance, about the kind of gray area maneuvering that every company engaged in. He couldn't see that this was about the human cost of his choices, about the families who had lost their retirement security, about the children who were developing cancer, because he had decided that proper environmental disposal was too expensive. "Dad, this isn't about regulations. This is about right and wrong. This is about the fact that you stole money from people who trusted you and then used it to buy yourself a vacation home. That money was an investment. We were going to pay it back with interest once the casino project turned around. The casino project failed 3 years ago. You've had plenty of time to pay those people back, but instead, you've been taking more money out of the fund to cover your losses." His face went through several different expressions before settling on something that looked almost like relief. "How do you know about that?" "Eleanor kept records of everything. Every transaction, every cover-up, every lie you told to hide what you were doing." For the first time since he had arrived, my father sat down. He slumped into my second-hand couch like a man who had finally accepted that his life was over. She knew everything. And she spent the last 2 years of her life trying to figure out how to fix what you had broken without destroying the family completely. Why didn't she come to me? Why didn't she give me a chance to make it right? The question was so absurd that I almost laughed. Because you would have done exactly what you're doing now. You would have minimized it, explained it away, found some way to justify it. You would have promised to fix things and then found new ways to hide the damage. My father put his head in his hands. When he spoke again, his voice was muffled and broken. "I never meant for it to go this far. It started small, just moving some money around to cover a temporary shortfall. But then the casino deal went south, and we needed more capital, and the pension fund was just sitting there earning minimal interest. So you decided to gamble with other people's retirement money. I was trying to grow it. If the casino had succeeded, everyone would have made a fortune. The pensioners would have had more money than they ever dreamed of. But it didn't succeed, and instead of admitting your mistake, you covered it up and kept stealing." He looked up at me with eyes that were red-rimmed and desperate. "What do you want from me, Michelle? You want me to grovel? You want me to beg? Fine, I'm begging. Call off the investigation. Tell them it was all a misunderstanding. We can pay back the pension fund, clean up the environmental sites, make everything right." "With what money? The FBI has frozen your assets. The company is facing millions in lawsuits. You're probably going to prison. With your money, you're worth $50 million now. You could fix all of this and still have more money than you could spend in a lifetime. And there it was, the real reason he had come here. Not to apologize, not to take responsibility, but to ask me to use Eleanor's inheritance to bail him out of the consequences of his own choices. Even now, facing federal charges and the complete destruction of his reputation, he still thought he could manipulate me into saving him. Dad, that money isn't mine to spend on cleaning up your messes. Eleanor left it to me to build something better, not to perpetuate the same corrupt system that you created. Something better? You mean your little art career? You're gonna use $50 million to finger paint while your family goes to prison? The contempt in his voice was so familiar that it almost felt comforting. This was the father I remembered, the one who had dismissed every dream I had ever shared, who had made it clear that my choices were worthless unless they served his vision of success. No, Dad, I'm going to use it to restore the Thompson name to what it was supposed to represent. I'm going to compensate the people you've hurt, clean up the environmental damage you've caused, and build a company that actually serves the community instead of exploiting it. And what about us? What about your family? You stopped being my family the day you decided I wasn't worth loving unless I conformed to your expectations. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him trying to process this new reality. For 28 years, he had dismissed me as a failure, a disappointment, someone whose opinions didn't matter. Now I was the one with the power, and he was the one begging for mercy. Michelle, please. I know I haven't been the father you deserved. I know I made mistakes. But we're still family. That has to count for something. For just a moment, I felt the pull of old patterns, the desperate desire to be accepted, to be loved, to be seen as worthy by the people who had raised me. Part of me wanted to believe that this crisis had changed him, that somewhere underneath the panic and desperation was a man who genuinely regretted the choices he had made. But then I remembered Linda's voice, dripping with fake sympathy as she tried to convince me that Eleanor had been too confused to know what she was doing. I remembered Jessica calling me an outsider, as if I had never belonged in the family that bore my name. I remembered years of feeling small and worthless and wrong for wanting something different than what they had planned for me. Family doesn't threaten to tie up your inheritance in court until you're old and gray. Family doesn't call you vindictive and bitter for refusing to be a doormat. Family doesn't steal from pensioners to fund their lifestyle and then ask you to cover for them when they get caught. My father's shoulders sagged. So that's it? You're just going to watch us all go down? I'm going to watch you face the consequences of your choices. Just like I had to face the consequences of mine when you cut me off for pursuing art instead of business. He stood up slowly, like an old man whose joints were too stiff to move easily. You know, your mother would be ashamed of what you're doing. My biological mother, who had died when I was 6, the woman I barely remembered except in fragments and photographs. It was a low blow, even for him, using her memory as a weapon against me. My mother would be proud that I chose integrity over wealth. She would be proud that I'm using my inheritance to help people instead of hurt them. Your mother was a dreamer, just like you, and look how that turned out for her. The cruelty of the comment took my breath away. My mother had died in a car accident, not because she was a dreamer, but because a drunk driver had run a red light. To use her death as some kind of cautionary tale about the dangers of having ideals was so twisted that I couldn't even formulate a response. But maybe that was for the best, because anything I said would have just given him more ammunition, more ways to hurt me. Instead, I walked to the door and opened it. Get out, and don't come back. He started to say something else, but I held up my hand. Dad, I'm going to give you some free advice. When the FBI comes to interview you, tell them the truth. All of it. Because I've already given them copies of Eleanor's files, and they're going to know when you're lying. The color drained from his face. You gave them the files? Every document, every email, every piece of evidence that Eleanor collected over the years. They have a complete picture of what Thompson and Associates has been doing, and they have the financial records to prove it. He walked past me toward the hallway, then stopped and turned back one last time. You think you've won something here, but you haven't. You've destroyed everything our family built. And for what? To make yourself feel better about being a failure? I'm not the failure in this family anymore, Dad. You are. After he left, I double-locked the door and sat down on my couch, feeling emotionally drained but also strangely peaceful. The confrontation I had been dreading for years was finally over. No more hoping he would change. No more believing that maybe someday he would see me as worthy of his love and respect. The relationship was finished, and I was free to build something new. The phone rang almost immediately. It was Sarah Martinez calling with an update on the legal proceedings. The FBI had moved faster than anyone expected, obtaining warrants to seize Thompson and Associates' corporate accounts and computer systems. They had also issued subpoenas for my father, Linda, and Jessica to appear before a federal grand jury within the week. "How are you holding up?" Sarah asked. "I know this can't be easy watching your family go through this." "They're not my family anymore," I said, and was surprised to find that I meant it. "My family died with Eleanor. These people are just strangers who happen to share my last name." That's probably the healthiest way to look at it. Because I have to warn you, things are going to get uglier before they get better. Desperate people do desperate things, and your father is facing the possibility of decades in federal prison. As if to prove her point, my phone buzzed with a text message from Linda. "This is all your fault. I hope you're satisfied with what you've done to us." Then another one. "Jessica's in the hospital. Anxiety attack. Are you happy now?" And another. "When your father kills himself, his blood will be on your hands." I showed the messages to Sarah over video chat. Her expression grew grim as she read them. "Michelle, I think you need to consider getting a restraining order. And maybe hiring some security. People who have lost everything have nothing left to lose." The thought hadn't occurred to me, but she was right. Linda's messages were clearly designed to manipulate me, to make me feel guilty for standing up for myself. But there was an edge of genuine desperation that made me wonder what she might be capable of if she got desperate enough. "I'll think about it," I said. "But right now I want to focus on the positive side of this. The pension fund restoration, the environmental cleanup, the new direction for the company. Speaking of which, I've been working on a plan for how to structure the transition. Thompson and Associates is going to need new leadership, a new board of directors, and a complete overhaul of its business practices. Are you prepared for that level of responsibility?" It was a fair question. A week ago, I had been a struggling artist working part-time jobs to pay rent. Now I was supposed to be the CEO of a major real estate development company. The scale of the challenge was daunting. But I thought about Eleanor, lying in her hospital bed and crying as she told me about the families who had been hurt by the company's greed. I thought about the pensioners who were facing poverty in their old age, because my father had gambled away their security. I thought about the children who were getting sick because proper environmental cleanup was seen as an unnecessary expense. "I'm ready," I said. "I might not know everything about running a business, but I know the difference between right and wrong, and I know how to listen to people who are smarter than me." "Good, because I've already identified several candidates for key positions. People with clean records and genuine expertise who could help you rebuild the company's reputation." We spent the next hour going over the details of the transition plan. It was complex and expensive, and would probably take years to fully implement. But for the first time in my adult life, I had the resources to tackle a problem without having to worry about whether I could afford to do the right thing. After I hung up with Sarah, I looked around my small apartment one more time. Tomorrow, I would start looking for a new place to live. Something bigger, befitting my new role as the head of a major corporation. But I would keep this apartment too, as a reminder of where I had come from and what I had learned during my years of struggling. The phone rang again, and I saw Jessica's name on the caller ID. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Michelle," she said, and her voice was thick with medication. "I'm in the hospital." "I heard," Linda texted me. "I almost died. My heart was beating so fast they thought I was having a heart attack. The doctors say it was a severe panic attack brought on by stress." I waited for her to continue, not sure what she expected me to say. "This is all your fault," she continued, echoing Linda's text. "I'm 23 years old, and my life is completely ruined because you couldn't just take the money and disappear." "Jessica, your life isn't ruined. You're young, you're educated, and you have skills that any company would value. The only thing you've lost is the guarantee that you would inherit wealth you didn't earn." "Didn't earn?" Her voice rose to a near shriek. I worked at that company for 3 years. I learned the business. I built relationships with clients. I did everything that was expected of me. For 3 years. While I spent 10 years being told I was worthless because I chose a different path. That's not the same thing. You chose to leave. I chose to stay and contribute. Contribute. As if showing up to a job at her father's company, where she was guaranteed advancement regardless of her performance, was some kind of sacrifice. As if she had ever faced a single obstacle or challenge that hadn't been smoothed away by family connections. Jessica, I hope you get better. I hope you find a way to build a life that makes you happy. But I'm not responsible for your choices or their consequences. So that's it? You're just going to abandon your family? My family abandoned me years ago. I'm just finally accepting that fact. I hung up before she could respond, then immediately blocked her number along with Linda's and my father's. Whatever guilt they were trying to make me feel. Whatever manipulation they were attempting. I was done being their victim. The rest of the day was a blur of phone calls and meetings. Reporters wanting statements, lawyers needing documentation, federal agents requesting interviews. Through it all, I kept thinking about Eleanor and the conversations we had during those Sunday afternoons in her garden. She had known this day would come. She had known that exposing the truth would destroy the family as we knew it. But she had also known that some things were more important than family loyalty. Justice was more important. Integrity was more important. The welfare of innocent people was more important. By evening, the story had gone national. CNN was running a segment about corporate corruption in family businesses. The Wall Street Journal had picked up the financial angle, focusing on the pension fund theft. Social media was buzzing with commentary about inherited wealth and accountability. I was no longer just Michelle Thompson, the struggling artist from Denver. I was Michelle Thompson, the whistleblower who had brought down her own family's empire. Some people were calling me a hero. Others were calling me a traitor. But for the first time in my life, nobody was calling me a failure. As I got ready for bed, I looked at myself in the mirror and saw someone I barely recognized. Not the uncertain girl who had been desperate for approval, not the struggling artist who had lived in fear of poverty, but a woman who had the power to change things and the courage to use it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new ways for my former family to try to hurt me. But tonight, I was at peace with my choices. I had chosen justice over loyalty, truth over comfort, integrity over wealth. And I would choose the same way every time. 6 months later, I stood in the renovated lobby of what was now called Thompson Community Development, watching as the last of the old corporate portraits were removed from the walls. The expensive oil paintings of my father and grandfather had been replaced with photographs of the communities we served, the families whose pensions had been restored, and the environmental cleanup projects that were finally nearing completion. The federal trial had concluded 3 weeks ago with verdicts that surprised no one who had been following the case. My father received 15 years for wire fraud and money laundering. Linda got 8 years as an accessory after the fact. Jessica, who had cooperated fully with prosecutors once she realized the extent of the corruption, received probation and community service. She had also changed her last name and moved to Portland, where she was apparently working as a marketing coordinator for a nonprofit organization. I felt no satisfaction in their downfall, no sense of victory or revenge. What I felt was relief. Relief that the truth had finally come to light, that justice had been served, and that the stolen money was being returned to the people who deserved it. The pensioners were receiving their full benefits plus interest. The environmental cleanup was ahead of schedule. The cancer victims had received compensation that would cover their medical expenses for life. Sarah Martinez knocked on my office door, carrying a stack of documents that needed my signature. "The final pension disbursement is ready to go out," she said, setting the papers on my desk. "Mrs. Henderson wanted me to tell you that she's naming her new granddaughter Michelle, in honor of everything you've done for their family." Mrs. Henderson, whose husband had worked for Thompson and Associates for 37 years before dying of a heart attack 2 months after learning his pension had been stolen. She was 74 years old and had been working as a grocery store cashier to make ends meet when I found her. The pension restoration had allowed her to retire with dignity and help raise her grandchildren. "That's very kind of her," I said, signing the documents with the Mont Blanc pen that had once belonged to Eleanor. "How are the other families adjusting?" "Better than expected. Most of them never thought they'd see that money again. A few have asked if they can tour the new community center we're building in Aurora, the one where the contaminated apartments used to be. The Aurora project was my proudest achievement so far. Instead of just cleaning up the environmental damage and walking away, we had demolished the unsafe buildings and constructed a state-of-the-art community center with a health clinic, job training programs, and affordable housing units. It was the kind of development that actually improved people's lives, instead of just generating profit for investors. "Schedule the tour for next week," I said, "and make sure the local media knows about it. I want people to see what responsible development looks like." After Sarah left, I walked to the window overlooking downtown Denver. The view from the 32nd floor was spectacular, but I rarely took time to appreciate it anymore. Running a company, even a reformed one, required constant attention. There were projects to oversee, employees to manage, and a reputation to rebuild one ethical decision at a time. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Congratulations on destroying our family. I hope it was worth it." It was the first contact I'd had from any of them since the trial ended. I deleted the message without responding and blocked the number. The irony wasn't lost on me. They still believed I had destroyed the family, when the truth was that I had simply refused to help them continue destroying themselves. The Thompson name was more respected now than it had been in years, precisely because we had chosen accountability over cover-ups. My assistant knocked and reminded me that I had a speaking engagement that evening. The Denver Business Ethics Council had invited me to share my story with a group of young entrepreneurs. The invitation had been both flattering and terrifying. Public speaking still made me nervous, but I was getting better at it. The auditorium was packed with people who looked like younger versions of myself. Idealistic, ambitious, and probably struggling to balance their principles with their desire for success. I had been in their shoes not so long ago, convinced that choosing integrity meant choosing poverty. 6 months ago, I began. I was a struggling artist who couldn't afford health insurance. Today, I'm the CEO of a $50 million company. But the most important change isn't in my bank account. It's in how I sleep at night. I told them about Eleanor's legacy, about the choice between easy money and hard truths, about learning that real success meant building something that made the world better rather than just making yourself richer. I talked about the pensioners who were finally able to retire with dignity, about the families who no longer had to worry about contaminated water, about the community center that was employing local residents and providing healthcare to people who couldn't afford it elsewhere. During the question and answer session, a young woman raised her hand. "Do you ever regret exposing your family? Do you ever wish you had just taken the money and stayed quiet?" It was the question I got most often, and it was also the easiest to answer. "Never," I said without hesitation, because staying quiet would have meant being complicit in their crimes. It would have meant that my grandmother's final gift to me was blood money. It would have meant that every dollar I spent was a dollar stolen from someone who deserved it more. After the event, I drove to the cemetery where Eleanor was buried. I visited her grave every few weeks, usually bringing flowers from the garden at my new house in Lakewood. I had bought the mansion from Eleanor's estate, mainly because I couldn't bear the thought of strangers living in the place where we had spent so many meaningful afternoons together. "I kept my promise," I said, placing white roses on her headstone. "The company is clean now, the people who were hurt are being taken care of, and the Thompson name means something good again." The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment I could almost hear her voice telling me how proud she was. Eleanor had taken an enormous gamble when she chose to leave everything to me instead of her biological son. She had bet that love and integrity would triumph over greed and corruption. So far, she was winning that bet. As I drove home, I thought about the life I was building. It wasn't the life I had planned when I was